Welcome, everyone. I'm Danny Elkins, the COO of 70 Faces Media and a proud former colleague of Nate Geller's of Chana Livracha. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you to Lynn and the whole Geller family for enabling us to have our fourth annual conversation in memory of Nate. We miss Nate dearly at 70 Faces Media, both for the work he did, but perhaps more importantly, for the passion he brought to our organization and his deep knowledge of Israel and Jewish history. During our time working together, Nate and I were often the first people in the office each morning. It gave us the opportunity to discuss Israel and world events, friends, and family. And to see so many people here tonight who meant so much to Nate, and to have the esteemed David Makovsky with us would mean the world to him. So thank you each for being here, and to the whole Geller family for your support and friendship. I'll now turn the evening over to Ami Eden, the CEO and executive editor of 70 Faces Media, to introduce David Makovsky and tonight's conversation.
Hi, thank you so much, Danny. I'll just say amen to everything you said about Nate. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Project on Arab-Israel Relations. He is also an adjunct professor of Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies and president of the board for the National Library of Israel's U.S. affiliate. In 2013-14, he worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as senior advisor to the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He is also the host of the podcast focusing on the U.S., Israel, and Middle East called Decision Points. We are so excited to have David with us tonight. So we will turn it over to him. And just again, David, thank you for being here. And in short, what I said in my intro was there are a lot of people who speak smartly or pretend to speak smartly about a lot of things happening in the Middle East. You definitely do that, but it also comes from a uniquely well-informed, diverse set of data points in terms of being somebody who's got an access and a curiosity with a lot of players in the region, which mixed with your insightfulness offers a unique blend whenever we get to hear you talk about these issues. So thank you for being here tonight. Really appreciate it. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Ami, and I apologize for any inconvenience. It's a long story, but it's not worth going into. I want to thank Thea, who's the go-to person for so much, and delighted to be with you. I heard through Thea a lot about Nate, and so I'm glad. I see Glenn Frankel in the audience. I haven't seen in a long time, and I'm sure there are many others. Look, I'm going to try to cover, there's so much to say and there's so little time, so I'm going to try to hit some like top line points to the extent I can. I want to cover, I want to say a word about the Gulf before getting into the war itself, and then talk a little bit about the war and talk a little bit about the U.S.-Israel piece of this. Also, given some of the recent Pew polling numbers, and then I'm looking forward to the conversation with Ami, and we'll take it from there. So, look, I think it's important to say that unlike the Gaza war, this is a case where I think for the most part, Israel and the Arabs are on the same side. Now, the word Arabs is a big word because there's different Arabs. But I think when it comes to the states, you basically, and the center of gravity in the Middle East, it used to be the Levant. We used to hear about Egypt, as the center of the Arab world. But clearly the center of the Arab world has moved to the Gulf. And that's where the money is. That's where a lot of the influence is. And basically, the Arabs and the Israelis are on the same team in this one. I mean, I don't know if any of us would have foreseen a future where Israel is sending something that it has in very finite capacity, Iron Dome, to defend an Arab country. That's what's been going on now for the last couple months. Certainly the UAE, it's not a typical Arab state, but it's a country that has really developed a strategic relations with Israel. And you have an Israeli, I don't know if it's a 2-star or a 3-star general, but basically with teams of people, using the Iron Dome to shoot down Iranian missiles fired at the Emirates. And as the Emiratis like to tell you, they're not 2,000 kilometers away like Israel is. They don't have like all this time for shelters. They don't even have a shelter system like Israel. They're right on Iran's doorstep. They're very vulnerable. And the fact that Israel is there with the IDF to defend an Arab country is not a small thing. I think this is often lost. You won't read about it in many publications about that. And as a senior Emirati official said to me, Israel was there in our moment of need. We'll never forget this. But it's not just the Emirates. I think there's some more going on with other Gulf states too. Maybe not to the same extent, but it does make an impression on the Emiratis, for example, that they know that the Iron Dome is finite. They know Arrow 3 is finite. And, and that Israel is sharing that to defend an Arab country is something that you don't read about that often. So I think that needs to be said. And this isn't like a continuation of the really tough time that it's been. There's been no greater stress test for the Arab states than since October 7th. And yet I learned one of my, Glenn remembers when I was a journalist many, many moons ago, sometimes the news, and I'm here, with the JTA, the news isn't always what happens. The news is what doesn't happen. And here, with the greatest stress test the Middle East could imagine since October 7th, none of the Arab states have rescinded their signature of the Abraham Accords. If anything, the military relationships have deepened. Now, the public engagement is frozen. So I don't want to like sugarcoat things. But the mill to mill, the fact that that Morocco, Bahrain, the Emirates for sure have all deepened their military ties with Israel in these last few years, despite the outcry of protest is not a small matter. So I think that somehow needs to be said. I know Thea's brother, Leon, always would say, in Jewish history, the Jews always wanted to make vertical alliances rather than horizontal ones, meaning that the publics were not always some ones you could count on, but the governments you felt you could make a deal with. So I think this has been a hard period since October 7th is the understatement of the century. But I think we sometimes need to take a step back and zoom out and say, wow, but it held in the greatest stress test imaginable. But unlike the Gaza situation, this is in terms of U.S.-Israeli-Arab relations, this is a much better situation where the Arabs and the Israelis, I think, are on the same side. And I would argue, and I said this to a Gulf ambassador recently in Washington, I said, if all of the heads of the 6 Gulf states were sitting in a room and were saying, we made a bargain in 2019. 2019 is kind of considered a key moment because there was an Iranian attack on Aramco facilities, a big oil production facility in Saudi Arabia. And the United States, this is the first Trump administration, didn't do anything about it. And one of the Gulf ambassadors said to me, our takeaway is, we have to hedge. We can't rely on America. We're on our own. If the United States isn't going to support the Saudis, they're certainly not going to support the rest of us. So I think since 2019 to 2026, the Gulf strategy has been, stay on the fence. Don't stick your neck out for the United States, because they're not going to be there for you. And they adopted a more, I would say, an accommodationist kind of approach in dealing with Iran. And I asked this Gulf ambassador, I said, if all of you, could now sit together and say, what went wrong? For 7 years, we tried one strategy and it didn't work. What's our takeaway? And he said, our takeaway is we have to more in collective defense, and we can't be shy about Israeli technology. That's key for us. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And that's stuff that maybe you don't read on the record, but that I think gives some contextualizing. Okay, having said that preface, where are things now? I mean, you read like Trump every day, it's a different thing. I'm going to kill them tonight. I'm going to kill them tomorrow. I'm going to go back in the war now. I'm going to keep going back in. This brinkmanship continues, since really early, whatever it was in April, the approach has been, like who's got the higher pain threshold? Each one made a bet. Basically, the Iranian bet was the West doesn't have the stomach. America is a weak country. They have a weak stomach. They can't last on $5, a gallon gasoline. The president's got midterms. He's hanging by a thread. He might lose. Inflation goes up. It's going to impact the bond market. The bond market's going to impact the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the Iranian bet that America is a weak stomach. The U.S. bet is the reverse that says, look, Iran is a very impoverished country. Its only revenue is oil. If you blockade the Straits of Hormuz, they don't have even a place for storage, and that's going to impact their wells, and they can't hold out. So basically, there's been just brinkmanship for the last month or so. And the question is, how much longer can this go on? I think the president is raising the ante a bit, saying, well, I'll give it another 3 or 4 days. I was an hour away. I think he said today or yesterday from doing this. And the Iranian, I saw someone just put something in the chat. I mean, Iran, their implicit bet is to say, look, we just slaughtered 32,000 of our own people. We're an authoritarian state and we have a huge stomach. I mean, if we could kill our own people to impose more economic costs, it's not such a big deal. I mean, I hate putting it that way, but each one has made a big bet in a certain way. And now the question is that impasse about to be broken? I kind of think that's the context we're in, or you could say, look, it's just more bluffing on each side, and it's, masha haya ze masha yeh. What was, what is what will be, could be. Now, where does the U.S.-Israel stand on this? It's clear for the U.S. the number 1, 2, 3 issue, I think, is the Straits. Because of how central it is to the world economy. Maybe it's not as central to American export, but there is one global price for oil. So even if we are a net exporter in America, if Japan goes into recession and this one goes into recession, it affects us in that way. We want to keep the lanes open. I think for Israel, the top 3 is the stockpile. It's the nuclear issue. Now, I want to be fair to the president. I want to be fair to Trump. He says he always frames it saying, people ask him about the $5 a barrel oil and all that. And he said, look, they cannot get a nuclear weapon. So it's unfair to say he doesn't care about the stockpile. The stockpile, just to be clear, so I don't get jargony on you, is what we think is what is underground, deeply underground in 3 places: Fordo, maybe at most in Isfahan, and Natanz, the places that were hit last June. And the question is, how do you get it out? Now, it's obviously preferable to get it out by an agreement, but an agreement that you could verify, with the IAE, the International Atomic Energy Agency, etc. That was the preference, but from what we see, release reported publicly, the gap seemed very wide. And I don't know, I mean, Trump, I'm not always sure when he says things, does he believe what he says or not? But, he said, well, I told the 3 Arabs he really cares about are the ones he tweeted about on Truth Social. He doesn't care about the Arabs. He cares about 3 Arabs: the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS Mohammed bin Salman, and the head of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ. So the MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, MBZ of of the UAE, MBS of Saudi Arabia, MBZ the UAE. Those three Arabs, he cares a lot what they think uh, because of their wealth and their influence. So he says, well, they asked him to delay. So he said he delayed. We'll see. But I think the question is, okay, I mean, you could see a situation where Iran backs off the Straits of Hormuz and the U.S. backs off the blockade. Now, of course, Iran might say, well, this is our best leverage. We're not going to really back off unless we have a new status. Maybe it's not called a toll booth, but something, a waterway consortium. Now, the Gulf is not going to want that. They're not going to want the Iranians to emerge from this crisis believing that they've been emboldened. And then we'll have to see how that plays out because the U.S. does not want and the Gulf does not want Iran to come away as the winner. I mean, they have very little. They have this crazy situation of like 1.9 million rials to a dollar. I mean, it's just the inflation is through the roof. It's important to remember how this whole thing began with social unrest, not of the women this time, not of the students this time, but of the merchant class, what they call the bazaris, the people of the bazaar, of the merchant areas in Tehran. That's how it began because life just became intolerable. And the president of Iran basically said, I don't have much I could do for you. Maybe I could do $7 a month, the equivalent. $7 a month is not going to change things. And now Iran they don't have a defense industry. I mean, 80% of it has been bombed by the United States and Israel. So to get to zero, that's another tens of billions of dollars. Can they somehow get some grip on the straits that would mean the price of oil keeps going up, that they could pay for some of this? Maybe a little bit, but I don't know, appreciably so. They want sanctions relief, and they want it both ways. I'm not saying they're the only country that wants it both ways, but they clearly want it both ways. They're like, I know what you want. You want us to ship out the stockpile because it's the nuclear material that's at the bottom of these mountains, of these nuclear hidden facilities that they could try to, enrich to what we call weapons grade and hold that up over the world. They would like to say, we'll give you some of this, but we'll ship out some of this to Russia like we did under the JCPOA, the nuclear deal of Obama, but we don't want to give you all of it. And maybe we'll do some down blending, like dilute some of this below 60%, but we want to keep enough of it that if we want to dial it back up, we can enrich again. Now, it's going to be harder because unlike 2015, when we actually had enrichment facilities, they've been bombed. So it's not going to happen immediately. But we want to be paid off. We want to be sure that even for a partial deal, we get billions and billions of sanctions relief. And that's something to think about. And I don't think we've thought enough about the trade-offs here. Because right now it's harder for Iran to give $1 billion to Hezbollah if they don't really have hard currency. So sanctions relief is a new lease on life. Now, how much of a lease on life? It depends. We don't know. But some would say, listen, why don't you just forget all this? There's not going to be a deal. The U.S. Minimum and the Iranian maximum there's no Venn diagram on that, possibly. Maybe you're just better off, and I think it's something to discuss. I don't claim I have the answer, to just saying, we don't want to give you sanctions relief, and we're just going to be sure our intelligence satellites of America and Israel are always going to be able to determine, can anyone get close to these areas and extract them? It's not a lot. It's only like, whatever it is, 440 kilo. Will the intel be that good to make sure that they can't extract? We don't know. Another thing, so I think the nuclear sanctions trade-off is something to think about. Bibi's answer to that is just go in there without a deal and militarily get it out. You have to believe the Iranians have booby-trapped everything. If there's no surprises here. I mean, that's more than anything what they're expecting is some sort of military assault on these sites. But that Netanyahu's view is don't pay any price, just get the nuclear material out. You got to wonder if Israel and all its special forces units, I am sure, have done a ton of contingency planning. Is that something the U.S. is going to feel comfortable with? Is something Israel's going to feel comfortable with? I think we don't know. But I think there's the whole nuclear question where and the question of priorities, where I think the U.S. still wants the straight number one, and Israel wants the nuclear number one. Another thing to think about is the issue of the ballistic missiles, which hasn't really come up. I mean, when Israel put forward its goals, it really focused on three things, which was the nuclear, the proxies, the money, and that's a function, I think, of the sanctions relief, money to Hezbollah, money to the Houthis, money to Hamas. And the third is the ballistics. And Dennis Ross, my colleague, and I had a briefing with a high-level Israeli in December. And the person he had to see the look on this guy's face, to get a sense. He said to us, he said, look, what's changed for us since June is the speed by which they could reconstitute the ballistics missiles. They're going quicker than we thought. If they were producing 110 of these a month, they're up to 70 now a month, 6 months out. The war was in June. Our briefing was in December. So can they pass 110 a month? Yeah, we don't think it won't take them that long. Why? They're more resilient. And, there's a phrase that Israelis have always been proud of in Hebrew. It's called il tur, their ability to improvise. He said they're really good at that, and they have an industrial base. I said sometimes when you do a patchwork or crazy quilt of stuff, you sacrifice on the quality. He said, well, not these guys have not sacrificed. Now, he said they've gotten luck, they've gotten support, and that is the Chinese have provided chemical precursors that have been key for their reconstitution. Now, Trump says that he met with Xi this weekend, and he got a commitment not to sell weapons. Did he get a commitment not to sell the chemical precursors for the ballistic missiles? We don't know. So I think, on the chemical, on the ballistics, I think, Israel's just hoping it destroys enough of what is done, but you can't assume it's over. That was the lesson, I think, of June, and that, I think, propelled them to go another round. Based on what I heard in December, that they were constituting quicker, we have to bomb them. So that makes me wonder this isn't the last round with Iran. Unless there's regime change, the whole regime change has become a whole industry in and of itself. It's very hard to do, because basically with the Iranians set up like what I call a Noah's Ark system after the Shah was deposed, which is we need two of everything. We need pairs. We'll have a regular military like a normal country, but we're going to have a Revolutionary Guard. We're going to have a Basij, and they're a repressive apparatus, and their job is to ensure nobody could do to us what we did to the Shah, because we don't rely on the military. They're not ideological. They're not really committed to this regime. We just have to pay a lot of people who are committed to be the ideological core of the regime. And that's hundreds of thousands of people. Now you could say, well, if they're not getting paid, or maybe they're lower level, maybe they'll defect, but we haven't seen any defections. I've seen it at a significant level right now. So we'll have to see. To summarize, I'm not claiming here any kind of a Makovsky grand plan. I'm just saying that there's trade-offs here to think about, and some things are not going to be resolved. On the regime change, would Bibi have liked it? Yes. But from my understanding, talking to the IDF and the U.S. military, when CENTCOM did the planning with the IDF, and they were already in Israel from January, is my understanding, before this war started in February 28th, it was not based on regime change. No matter what the New York Times reported, and I'm sure Bibi did say regime change. I have no doubt the Times is right about that. But the actual planning of the professional class that executed the war was not that. As a matter of fact, though, Netanyahu did for 5 days, is my understanding, did divert some of the Air Force to go after Basij headquarters in big cities, in Isfahan and Mashhad and all these other places. But Trump stopped them. I don't know if that's been reported in the press, but maybe it has been. But I that's my understanding, that he said, look, this isn't working. People are not coming to the streets. And better to keep the Air Force resources. And basically, Israel had over 200 planes. Israel's got more than, I mean, it's hard to believe we don't always think this way. Israel's got like twice the number of fighter aircraft than Great Britain. And as Jewish state, you don't think that Israel, I mean, you think of like Winston Churchill, the Royal Air Force, you have all these associations, but Israel has got twice the size of an offensive air force as Great Britain. Doesn't mean that you get cocky about these things, but it is unremarkable. But I understand that Trump said no more diversion to these areas. So because what happened was the people didn't come to the streets. Why? Because 42,000 or 33,000, we don't know the exact number, of Iranians were slaughtered. And the people with guns, we have someone at the Washington Institute, all she does is follow internal Iranian developments. And she said, look, the same people that lost their office in Isfahan and Mashhad and these places, they showed up with guns at key intersections in trucks, and they slept in trucks. And people are afraid. So the U.S. said, don't do that. Don't arm the Kurds. That had also kind of, it seems like, begun. But the U.S. has tried to keep it away from the regime change piece, and the professionals have tried to keep it away from the regime change piece for now because they don't see the people coming to the fore. So we'll see if there's another round. But this is a regime that is defined by what it considers to be resistance. And I don't know if another week or 2 weeks they'll assume it's short, of the second round, which we expect that will be a game changer. But we'll have to see how it goes. Let me just say something on the U.S.-Israel piece here and then open it up with Ami, and I'll do it real brief because I don't want to take up Ami's time and your time. I mentioned the divergences. Look, it's clear about, you've seen the Pew polls, 60% of Americans do not support Israel at this time. It's the highest, I think, in my lifetime. And a few years ago, we used to talk about progressives. It's gone beyond that. The numbers in the Democratic Party are very high. And even in the Republicans, among young Republicans and second generation evangelicals, we're seeing erosions there in support of Israel. Now, what will change it? Will a new government in Israel change it? I think it would take the edge off it. No one can know, for sure how much, but I think it's clear that it would, it could have an impact. As I said, I was interviewed by Yisrael Hayom on Channel 12 the last few days, and I said, just know anytime there are these vigilante developments in the West Bank of arson, of this minority of settlers, it gets enormous attention in the United States. And I know you're going to say to me, seven fronts, and you're going to say to me, we just don't have time to think about that. But because there's so much more to say, but I'm afraid to talk too long. So I'll just say this sentence. Look, the genius of the U.S.-Israel relationship, in my view, was that when faced between interests and values, the answer was yes. In other words, you didn't choose between them. You did both at the same time. Of course, you need the intel. Of course, you need the high tech. Of course, you need the missile defense. You need all those common interests because ultimately interests bind governments. But what Israel had that most countries do not have with the United States is the societal dimension. And if interests bind governments, it's values that bind peoples. And you play with that at your peril. I mean, if you go back to Truman and go to Johnson and go to Ronald Reagan and go to Bill Clinton and go to George W. Bush and go to Biden, I'm not saying every president, but the common values was the glue for them. And that has been Israel's hold on the imagination of the American people. You don't want to just be another country. You don't want to just be Belgium or Lithuania or some other country. You want to maintain that specialness. And here you've got horseshoe politics going on, where it's not just the edges anymore, but certainly the edges of both parties, Democrats and Republicans. Instead of it being a spectrum, like football fields from one end of the end zone to the other end zone, they're converging. Now, they're converging in different ways, of course, to be sure. On the Democratic side, it's more about how you're dealing with the Palestinian issue in Gaza. And on the Tucker Carlson side, who just did a long interview today, by the way, with Channel 13 in Israel, tonight's news, it's more about why does Israel have a special hold in Washington on decision making. So it's different critiques, but it's worrisome. And my hope is that Israel does not cede the value space. I think you don't come back from that. I mean, look at the Saudis. For all their influence and power, they have not been good on the bipartisan side. For a while, he was the ambassador. He moved to Switzerland, I think, for 8 years during the Clinton period because he thought he had no common language. He was Bandar Bush. You want something that you have a way to connect with both parties. And I'm worried about Israel losing that. And so I just hope whatever new government is formed, that they don't cede the values space. It's just too valuable for Israel over the years. I mean, it didn't start with a honeymoon. I mean, people forget the first U.S. Military aid to Israel was 1962, defensive Hawk missiles under John F. Kennedy. The first visit of an Israeli prime minister was 1964, when Levi Eshkol met Johnson. I mean, Kennedy would meet Eshkol at the Waldorf Astoria or something in a corner somewhere. But the U.S.-Israel relationship was built over time. And so this Dickensian moment, if I had to summarize, and I'll stop with this, is it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. It's the best of times in terms of the intimacy that these two militaries, CENTCOM and the IDF, are flying wing to wing, shoulder to shoulder. And the U.S. hasn't done that since World War II with anybody. Yes, there have been coalitions of 60 countries, but those are all like window dressing for the United States, often fighting alone. This is unique. So it's the best of times in terms of that security intimacy, but it's the most challenging of times in terms of this public opinion piece that should not be ignored. You could say some of it is a Trump syllogism. I hate Trump. Trump loves Israel. I hate Israel. Or Trump loves Netanyahu. I hate Israel. There's a piece of that in here too. There's a lot of layers, but there are things that need to be done to repair this relationship. So best of times and most challenging of times. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, David. I'll pick up first where you finished with the best of times, worst of times. I want to push you on that a little bit to say, are they functions of each other in the sense that are we in a situation now where the depth of closeness in this military engagement is exactly what's going to fuel you mentioned what's happening on the right, a sense of it's not about Gaza per se, but this idea that Israel has this special relationship that if you want to believe the New York Times reporting that, Trump is consulting with Bibi in it's kind of a joint cabinet discussion about when and how to go to war, and the militaries are cooperating. So you have this unprecedented level of cooperation, but it's almost like it's almost gasoline to the fire for the people who are trying to unwind that relationship. So you mentioned before about bets and the bets they were making.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the calculus on the Israeli side in terms of, are they seeing this as not risky and cooperating this way is all positive, or is it, yeah, we know there's a risk, but this is it's an incomprehensible opportunity we have, and we have to take it. And if we're on our own in 10, 20 years, so be it. What's the Israeli thinking on this issue?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I try to watch the news in Israel in Hebrew in real time. I find it helps me. I usually try to watch either 13 or 12. I listen at midnight before I go to sleep. My wife thinks I'm a bit obsessive to the 7 a.m. news on Reshet Bet. I like Aryeh Golan, but it's just so fascinating to hear the conversation in different capitals because in Israel, they don't make any bones about it in the media. It's all up to Donald Trump. So Tucker Carlson could say it's all up to Bibi Netanyahu, but they were tweeting that I saw Alon Ben David, the top military analyst, was saying he started the program. He goes, well, Trump says he was about to start tomorrow. He said, we didn't even know about it. We learned about it through the tweet. So the Israelis seem to think all the decision making is in Trump's hand. Tucker Carlson is convinced that all the decision making is in Bibi's hands. So it's kind of interesting that way. But there's no doubt. As soon as I saw that Times piece, I said, "Oh boy, this is going to fuel the narrative like into outer space. You know, it'll turbocharge it." And again, I'm not saying there's nothing to that. I have a feeling that Times reporting was for the most part true. And that was, but I think it's just ironic that the professionals, their objectives was more like just degrade their capabilities. You're not going to do regime change and like this. I don't know. I think overall, though, the biggest damage to Israel was the Gaza war. I really
Right.
think that even if maybe for the Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens podcast wing, Iran is more the
Right.
critique because they don't really care about the Palestinians that much. But I do think the biggest damage, definitely on the Democratic side, was then. And the numbers, most of the damage has been out there for a while. This is more, I don't want to say icing on the cake, but it has not as been as decisive in the same way. And to be also fair, most of the Republicans have stuck with Trump. There has been a little bit of an erosion. I've been looking at the polls, but he's done much better than some people predicted. People thought there would be a MAGA revolt, and there hasn't been. He's faced them down too. I mean, he says he's not diplomatic with those three people. He just, oh, they're stupid, they're not intelligent. I mean, like he doesn't, they're mad at him too, because they feel that he's betrayed them and all that. But so Trump, I think, has held his base pretty well. Israel, I think, has always believed that the fight with Iran is existential because it's nuclear. So I'm sure Netanyahu felt like if it's ever going to happen, it's got to happen before the midterms. I tend to think the fact that they were recovering their ballistic capabilities, I was saying before, accelerated their thinking. But I don't know if this is the last round. I mean, I just expect a spurt now. And is a spurt next week? I don't know. But I think the Israeli thinking is more that this is an American decision, and they might get, the first notification. Yeah, Bibi's on the phone with him for like 20 minutes a night. And I'm sure he's playing what I call the Donald Trump music, like Donald, don't accept a bad deal, Donald. It's a bad deal, Donald. He's talking Trumpian to Trump.
Right.
But I don't think these things are decisive. I tend to think Trump has got his own calculations. That's how I see it. But
Do you do you think that it ultimately is Donald Trump's decision? Meaning, when he decides it's over, do you think that means Israel now
yes.
decides, okay, we're not bombing Iran anymore? Like, and
No,
that's
I think it's it. No, because any deal, if there is a deal, let's put it this way. If there's no deal, that gives Israel more wiggle room. If there's a deal, if you can't deliver the Israelis, what have you done? I mean, you haven't done a lot. So just like you remember, I mean, that famous day where, they don't know what the F they're doing, and the planes had to turn around on that
Right.
12th day of the war. They were 5 minutes apparently from their targets. Trump said it's over. It's over. Now, Lebanon, we haven't talked about yet, but there I wonder if Bibi goes to him and, will say, Donald, look, I'm going to lose my northern, communities if I don't do more against Hezbollah. I can't have the North be a ghost town. You got to give me some slack. So I'm sure he'll make a case there, but there too, it might be if there is a deal, Trump will do what he thinks is right for Trump. And so I don't think the Israelis will have an independent deal. Again, Lebanon might be different, but certainly on Iran. Now, if it ends unilaterally where Trump says, look, we're keeping eyes on the skies in these three places, these people are unreasonable, we bomb whatever we could, and it's inconclusive, then, there's no commitments in the same way. That might give Bibi more wiggle room. But certainly if there's some sort of a deal, the Iranians will never go for a deal with Trump if Israel is not part of the Iran deal, and they will obviously want a Lebanon deal too. And to some extent, it was Trump who concocted this, this Lebanon-Israel peace channel as a way to justify a ceasefire, but the ceasefire, of
Right.
course, has not really been a ceasefire. It's been a
Right.
ceasefire, but not hitting Beirut and maybe not hitting the Bekaa Valley. But anything below the Litani River, there's no ceasefire.
You talked about the Israelis and the U.S. and the Arab states and the Gulf states being on the same
Yeah,
side.
yeah.
That's not necessarily the same thing as having the same goals, the same interests. I mean,
No.
is your sense that, look, if forced to choose in this situation, it's clear now in 2026 they're with the Israelis, but that's different than saying what do they want the Israelis and the Americans to be doing right now? Do you have a read on that? Like
Yeah.
what do they want to see happen now?
All
What's
right.
an acceptable
From what I
outcome?
understand, there's what I'm learning is the more I try to learn about the Gulf is there's no the Gulf.
Right.
And here too, I'm not obviously critiquing any of the media here in this country, but I do think we need to have a more granular understanding of the Saudi Emirati rift, which has been written about, to be sure, but I don't think it's been written about enough. And how this plays out in 20 different ways, because clearly the Emiratis draw closer to Israel, I think, as a result of this experience. And again, they were close before. I mean, the only people flying when the United Airlines and Delta and all these people stopped flying to Israel, Fly Dubai is flying 6 times a day
Mhm.
in a war. And so, I mean, they were close before, and now that I think they get closer. But what I don't know is, I think the Saudis, until recently, had hoped there'll be a new government in Israel in the fall, and I mean, they're clued in Israeli politics. They certainly don't want to give Bibi a normalization deal that will make him the king of Israel for the next 20 years. So they're going to wait. But I kind of thought after, with a new government, they would be open to normalization. Now, I don't know, this tension between them. Oh, a lot of this is personality driven between MBS and MBZ. A lot of them it is over issues that we might think is esoteric, like whose rebels are on which side of the Sudanese conflict and the Yemeni conflict. So to a lot of people, like, we don't know the RAF or the RSF versus the SAF in Sudan. I mean, we don't follow that. So we don't know that. So some of it is proxy related. Some of that is, I think, MBS says, like, why should you have Dubai? I want NEOM to be the Dubai's Dubai. And that works when you have $90 a barrel of oil. But when the oil's been at 60, they've had to cut back their project. Anyway, some of this stuff sounds like irrelevant, but I don't know if that is going to impact Saudi calculations after the new Israeli government on normalization, which I did think they wanted. I think Trump wants very badly. He thinks he can get 2 Nobel Prizes, I think, out of this. And so we don't know enough. So when I say, is there the Gulf? I don't think there is the Gulf strategy. I think the Emirates have a strategy. The Saudis don't go as far on the Israeli side as the Emiratis do, and there are these other countries in between. But it is remarkable, Ami, that Qatar and Oman, who you would have
Right.
thought being so solicitous of the Iranians,
Right.
didn't spare them. And to me, again, maybe I don't know enough to understand, it seems to me to be a terrible self-inflicted wound by the Iranians to turn all these people against you, all these wealthy people
Right.
against you who didn't want to be your enemy,
Right.
and you fired on them anyway.
But do you think when we read that Trump is saying I'm putting a pause because all of these Gulf leaders are asking me to try to get a deal at this point, is your sense that that is what they want? That they
I'm
want?
not sure. I mean, the Emiratis, I think, feel they've taken it in the neck more than anybody. The Iranians cannot come out of this ahead.
Right.
The Saudis, you hear stories that they want to cut their own deals. I don't know if that's fair to them. They have actually attacked. There was something in the Wall Street Journal, I think, yesterday about they've done some attacks they just don't talk about. Um, I'm sure he knows that they prefer a deal, but they prefer a deal that Iran does not claim some sort of ownership over the Straits of Hormuz. That's horrible for them. Look, if I had to predict one thing with, like, I think 100% certainty, and it's hard to do this in this crazy world, and you say, oh yeah, well, that's a safer bet, that David, that's down the road, is if we know one thing for sure, this war, however it ends, the Gulf states are going to build a ton of infrastructure to circumvent the Straits of Hormuz. There's going to be much more Saudi east-west pipelines to the Red Sea. There's going to be a bunch of those things. I would hope that we have the vision, and I said this to Thea yesterday, so I want to tie this all together in like a little bit of a bow tie. I would hope that part of bringing the U.S. in, and I want to write about this, so I'm asking you guys, it'll take me a few weeks to write this, but I want to write this, but I want to give you kind of I somehow want to weave together a few elements here. If you think of what brought the U.S. and Israel close together is a common project. In the 1980s, it was the Soviet Jewry movement. The U.S. and Israel, 1 million people got out. Those 1 million people become like the foot soldiers for the startup nation. They're the infrastructure for Israel's high-tech thing. The 90s, whether you like Oslo, you hate Oslo, whatever it is, the common project of the 90s was peace. After 9/11, the common project was the war on terror. What I think is missing now is a common project between the U.S. and Israel. And I think that's what you really need. And now what I want to know is, can you weave this together with what the Gulf is for sure going to do on infrastructure and say, why is the Middle East the only region in the world where the trade within the region is fairly low? And this idea, which many American Jews don't follow it sounds jargony, it sounds a little futuristic, is something called IMEC, the Indian Middle East Corridor of railroads and trucks to bring goods all the way to Ashdod and Haifa, the two ports, and then as a gateway to Europe. We need some sort of regional integration. Maybe that word, it doesn't sound as romantic as the word peace or normalization, but some of normalcy of integration, because the Gulf is going to do a lot of infrastructure work in the next 10 years. It's clear, because they don't ever want to go through this again.
Right. I mean, what's interesting when you talk about that as the common U.S.-Israel project, in sharp opposition to, I think, the other projects you mentioned, that's not necessarily a project that's going to wed American Jews writ large to this Israel. When you think about the other ones you mentioned, I feel like there was like sort of an animating,
that's true,
unifying thing. In a lot of ways, this would just further signal kind of Israel leaning. I'm not saying it negatively, but just for the American Jews who have fallen away from Israel or feel alienated or struggling, it's
Sounds
not like
technical.
that thing is going to bring them back, bring them along, etc.
It sounds technical, but I would argue the word peace sounds better. The word Soviet Jew sounds better, but I would argue you could give the peace sturdier underpinnings if there was an economic kind of undergirding to this project. And it wasn't just dependent on peace processors, and stuff like that.
But does that, and again, not that it has to, but does that translate at all into Israeli-Palestinian peace, which for a certain segment is what it's all about?
I was just about to get to that.
Okay.
Look, after Camp David, I had a lot of journalists, and I was talking to me and he said, what do you think about it, David? I said, look, this can either be a bridge or a bypass road. The people on the Israeli right want it to be a bypass road. The people who are not on the right think it could also be a bridge. And I've seen myself maybe more in the center, but I think it could be a bridge. I think the Gulf could use its considerable wealth to help, minimize the risk of radicals in this. And, I tend to think they have no love for the Muslim Brotherhood either, for Hamas. And it might be economic projects that let people see that there's something to be gained here in the West Bank and things like that. So I just feel this is something Israel cannot do alone. And having the Arabs more involved in this, I think would be fun. I know there'll be people that will smirk and they will say, oh, so let me get this straight. Monarchies are going to teach the PA about reform. They're not Democrats. They're not Jeffersonians. Right. Yes, but on the other hand, many of them do have, they've modernized their economies pretty well, more than we realize. I see that because I go there now every year. I didn't used to go, and it's very
So I want to just want to run through a few questions from the chat. Maybe we
sure,
can do
sure,
these
sure.
in a
Whatever. I'll
quick.
stay as long as you want. I feel
Yeah,
bad
okay.
about being
Are
late.
the Gulf countries contributing financial resources to the conduct of this war?
I have to believe they are. They won't announce it, but I remember still when Baker went with like a tin cup before the first Gulf War and people paid up.
Right,
I know the argument, the counter argument goes like this. Well, you didn't really ask us on the takeoff to do this.
right,
So now on the landing, you want us to pay?
right,
I mean, I know that argument, but I also think the signals were a little more ambiguous. They weren't so
right,
negative in the run-up. I mean, my understanding is, some of the Gulf states said, look, if you're doing this, you got to go all the way.
right.
So,
Uh, Question: what happened? And you've touched on this, but maybe there's a
yeah.
what happens if Iran absolutely refuses to negotiate a nuclear deal? The nuclear issue has become. Does the nuclear issue become one that outlasts Trump and his will to fight them?
No, it's a great question. No, then the question, how does Trump end this if the Iranians are not willing to ship out the stockpile? It'll get into that gray zone that I talked about before, which is
Hmm.
the more highly enriched they ship out, and then they'll try to what they call downblend, dilute the lower enriched. But remember, even 20% is 80% of the way of
Right,
enrichment. So the
right,
numbers are a little misleading. Even
right.
20% is very significant. So, Israel is right to focus on this. The question is, at what point, if Trump calls it a day,
Right.
how does that end it with Israel? It's one thing to tell the Israelis, hey, we got a deal and you're bound by the deal. It's another thing to say there is no deal. So I don't know what you're
Right.
bound by. So that might give Israel a little more room. What I'm missing on the intel side is how ironclad is the intel? How good is it that with all the eyes in the skies from the United States, Israel, and every other intelligence agency, you will know for sure if they don't take that stockpile out. Um,
Is is there any realistic deal or end to this that could happen that would make the Israelis feel like, oh, if this is how it was going to end, then we wouldn't have done it? Or is their view like uniformly, like we have achieved so much militarily that any outcome now it made this worth it?
Well, look, you could say the proof will be in the pudding on how, I think for now, when Brad Cooper, not the actor from Hollywood, but the head of CENTCOM, when he says, the U.S. is destroyed with Israel 85% of their industrial base, Israelis will say, well, better off doing that than they would if they had all their ballistic missiles.
Right.
But unless there is regime change, you have to believe they're going to try to reconstitute. And the question is, to me, it comes down to one big idea, which is, do they come out of this conflict emboldened because they have a new status in the Gulf and the price of oil they can play with and use that extra money, to maintain their repressive apparatus or sanctions relief will be so significant, or do they emerge hollowed out? I mean, we should say that, and we should all be humble as pundits that the United States didn't predict when the Soviet Union would fall. I mean, it became increasingly clear at the very end, but okay, we didn't know. Didn't know when Mubarak, for all his grip of his mukhabarat, of his intel service, he didn't know that he was about to fall. And Assad didn't know
Right.
that he was going to fall. And yet we woke up one day and all three of them fell. So we
Right.
have to be a little bit humble that we don't know exactly when it comes to regime change, but we could see trajectories. And if they emerge hollowed out from this, that they have no answers to the economic grievances of their people, then it could be that time is on the side of those, who think this
Right.
regime is not bound to last. But I like to quote Isaac Bashevis Singer, who was asked when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. They said, "Why do you write in Yiddish? It's a dying language." And he said, "Okay, it's a dying language, but between dying and dead, it could be a long way."
Right.
So we don't know how long this regime will
Right.
go. We think it will, but how
So
this
one.
crisis turns out is a big deal.
So on that note, there was a question in chat about when we're talking about the regime in Iran, do we have a grasp really on who now is calling the shots? Who is really making the decision on any deal?
That's the huge question. I mean, this is the question I ask every official I meet. People tell me Mujtaba is alive, and now apparently he sent a message today telling Iranians to have a lot of children and things like that. But how much does he have the grip, the gravitas of his father? It's clear the Revolutionary Guards, we think, has greater weight in the system. And when people want to look at kind of a net assessment on how the war turned out, they'll say, well, was it a good enough deal that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards were emboldened? I don't know. Right now, it seems like they have more of a role. This guy Kalibov is in the parliament. Is he a player? And then you've got the official status of the people, what I call the people with the business cards. There's a president, there's a foreign minister, all those people. What's their relative weight on decision making? It's clear it's not going to be considered a big win if Iran has a new status in the Gulf, the nuclear stockpile is not taken out, and the Revolutionary Guards have, heightened decision-making authority. I just feel we need to be a bit humble, that's why I don't want to predict the outcome, because we don't know enough yet on the internal decision-making dynamics.
So we have a question about the West Bank, and I'll tie it to, earlier you mentioned, you say to the Israelis you're talking to every day when you're seeing these
Close my hair
attacks. Right. And I'll just say it's interesting, when you talk about what the Israeli campaign in Gaza, or you talk about, accounts in the Times, other places like the story about prisoner detainees, or even that. Let's just stick to Gaza. I think there's a lot of people who support Israel who ultimately understand, or if not outright support, understand what's happening in Gaza. They don't think the Israelis are purposely trying to do something, but rather they're waging a tough war. And then a lot of those things, I'm talking about Jewish leaders or rabbis I talk to, whatever, they may not feel publicly speaking out right now, but they think what's happening is just wrong or inconceivable in the West Bank. So we have a question from Bruce D. What is going on in the West Bank? And I guess what I want to push on that question is, what is going on? Is this a problem of, it's much tougher than you think to stop 500 to 1,000 difficult people? Or is there a sense that if it's not coming from the top, that in the ranks, there's a discipline problem, et cetera, to act on it? What is your sense of what the Israelis themselves think is happening here?
I try to ask everybody I can on this. I remember sitting with a senior IDF commander who said, I'm embarrassed to tell you, David, that we and the police and what's called Shai, that's there's a police unit in the West Bank, Shomron Yehuda.
Right.
He said, us and Shai, we're not on the same page because they're under Ben Gvir, and they're not arresting people. And if you don't arrest people, you're going to embolden more to come. And by the way, I'm not convinced that all these people who are coming are settlers. I think there's WhatsApp groups of hundreds of people. And when they get the word, they come from Modi'in, they come from Jerusalem, they come from other places, and they join in. And, I do say to people, I think it's a minority, clearly, of the settlers, but I would like to hear Moetzet Yesha, the Settlers Council, speak out. They have made some statements. I wish they would make it even stronger. I don't think anything's going to change in a good way until the elections, because Ben Gvir's the police minister. So, you have to, and I think there's this unit in the Shin Bet. There used to be a unit for Jews, and I don't think it's functioning right now under the new leadership. So,
right. So from where you sit and from what you hear, you think there is an operational problem from the top in terms of
yes. Yeah,
how
I'm not saying Ben Gvir is telling people
but it's the message you're sending. What's the priorities?
It's clear, and that's what makes it so terrible. If the government was making 100% effort and didn't 100% succeed, it would be more defensible. But because they don't seem to be making any effort to stop this at the political level by having the minister ensure that their arrest,
Right.
people will say there's a complicitness to this.
Right.
And we could get into the gray zone, how much and who and where, but uh, effort, we used to say about Arafat, you don't have to have 100% results, but you need 100% effort. And what soured the Israeli public to Arafat was they thought there was 0% effort.
Right.
And again, I'm not making comparisons. I want to be clear between arson and murder, but it is outrageous. And I was at a conference in the Gulf in Abu Dhabi, and I know these people. I go there every year, and none of these guys like Hamas. But I said ultimately the only people who could discredit Hamas are Arabs, and the only people who could discredit the settlers are Israelis.
Right.
And if you don't police your own, if you don't call out your own, then don't be surprised. And again, I'm not making moral equivalences here because I do think Hamas is a movement that blows up buses and
Right.
that, but unless people call out the spoilers, it's going to get worse. I mean, I tell
Yeah.
Israelis, I get so many that come through Washington, and I say to them, I said, look, you vote in the elections. I'm not a citizen. I don't vote.
Right.
But and the people, only the Israelis will decide who their leaders are. But I'm saying, like, the line of the Chafetz Chaim when it came to someone who's about to walk into a pit, because in the Torah,
Right.
this is the Dvar Torah, saying, some people would mumble the Tochacha, he said, and the Chafetz Chaim says, no, you have to scream it. Because
Right.
if he's your friend and he's about to walk into a pit,
Right.
you're not helping your friend. And I think
Right.
here too, if we're not clear about consequences, that I really think this is going to hurt American Jewish support for Israel, let alone the U.S. government.
So I want to ask you one wrap question, but I did want to clarify because when you were making this one mark, you said if Israel doesn't stick up for the settlers, and I know based on even what you said earlier, you're not in this. And for people who aren't plugged in, I don't think you're necessarily talking about all the settlers like in the way
Right.
you were
No,
just
I know. Like
talking.
I said, it's a minority of a
Right. So
minority.
I just wanted to clarify
No, no,
that.
no, I always say that. I always
Right.
say that
Yeah.
when the people use the word settler violence as if it's all settlers. But it would help if the Moetzet Yesha people were more vocal, even though I'm sure you could find me a few statements.
Yeah.
But there have been some very courageous rabbis, Moshe Lichtenstein and Gush Etzion. There are a few of them that have been, we need
Yeah.
rabbinic leadership here.
All right. So last thing I'll ask is like you're somebody you mentioned the horseshoe earlier.
Yeah,
You're like I think of you as the like polar opposite of the horseshoe, right? Like you've spent your whole career in a sense
yeah,
trying to build from the center and consensus.
yeah.
Um, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but if it's pessimistic, okay. If it's
Yeah.
optimistic, but like when you look out at what's happening in American politics, especially in the Democratic Party. And when you're looking at what's happening in Israel, like on some of the issues that we're talking about, like, do you see do you see a way forward to sort like the way you have tended to try to build, you know,
Yeah.
to build from the middle out, like, or do you feel lonely and
Look,
not
at
sure
the
what
end
the
of the
future
day,
holds?
I believe in deeply, or I guess I wouldn't be doing this all these years, in the fundamental compatibility of the mainstream American people and the American Jewish community with mainstream Israelis. And I do think that neither of them want to see the horseshoe. None of them, I'm counting on this election, however these people decide, and I deliberately didn't say names of anybody. But I am very worried about the configuration of the government, if it is the way it is. I'm not saying I disqualify this name, this
Right.
Netanyahu. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying is it's configured with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Those are the two names I'll mention. I am very concerned. Look, I hope you don't mind if I put in a plug for, my podcast, Decision
Yeah.
Points. I try to have conversations between Americans and Israelis on policy issues. And it's to try to show where the mainstream and the mainstream have that sense of compatibility.
Hmm.
I've not given in the towel and at all, and I'm counting on those mainstreams to realize that like you're getting near a cliff, folks, and We got to back away from the cliff and build the center up in a way that reflects the decades and decades of relationships where this relationship is deepened. And, to get to this point where the two militaries are flying shoulder to shoulder, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. As one Israeli general put it to me, he said, look, we didn't used to know any of ththese Pentagon. Now we go over to all these people's homes for barbecues. We get to know their families. I mean, a lot of people went to, if they started in the Eisenhower era, they would be shocked of how deep and wide this relationship has grown. And I fundamentally believe that there's a reason for that. And that's got to be the shared values, the shared interests. And I think you can't play with it. I'm just counting on the mainstream to come back from the cliff. So
Well, I think that's a really important and inspiring note to end on, and one I think that would certainly reflect Nate's values and wishes that he'd want to see. So I'd love to end it there. And David, just thank you so much. Always appreciate your analysis and the way you deliver it, and
Thank
and
you,
what
and
you
thank
know
you to
and the
all your
emotion
listening
you bring
people
to
and
it.
all that you do with JTA and all of that 70 Faces does to try to keep these faces strong, this relationship strong, and wishing everyone a Chag Sameach, given the upcoming Shavuot and upcoming Memorial Day, and people who've sacrificed so much. So because we all know that freedom isn't free. So
Okay,
thank you.
so thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks a
Bye-bye.
lot.